So today would have been my grandfather, Andrew Gumps Anderson's 100th birthday. He was born on May 24th, 1923, in the small mining village of Donkin, Nova Scotia. His father, Arthur McKean Anderson, his grandparents, Andrew Anderson and Elizabeth Logan Anderson, were the first of my Anderson family to come from Scotland to work in the mines of Cape Breton, arriving in 1832. His mother, Elizabeth Anderson, emigrated to Cape Breton in 1905 at the age of 13 with her parents Robert Baxter and Elizabeth Kinnaird, who left Midlothian and sailed to Canada on the SSR Sardinia. Andrew, or Gumps as he was known from his youth to his death, was the seventh of 12 children. Growing up in Donkin, he lived in a company house during the height of the Great Depression. And it couldn't have been an easy thing, though his family did have the first radio in the village.
We had the first radio in Donkin.
Really?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I guess the neighbors used to want to listen
Oh
too.
my, yes. The house was always full.
Yeah,
And all the kids loved to come.
yeah.
And the Anderson boys were all great athletes, especially hockey players, sharing skates and learning the game on Schooner's Pond. But none were as good as his older brother, Robert, or Fess Anderson, who actually earned a tryout with the Montreal Canadiens. Anyways, my grandfather did not want to work in the mines like his brothers and all the Anderson men since arriving in Canada and before had done. He excelled in math and he wanted to be an engineer. In 1939, Canada went to war against Germany and its allies for the second time in the century. Now, Gumps was itching to enlist, but he wasn't old enough yet, and his mom wanted him to finish school. In late 1942, he met my grandmother, Charlotte McKinnon, from the nearby town of Glace Bay, where he was working at the town's Eaton store. He finally enlisted in January of 1943, and after training and becoming part of the Royal Canadian Highlanders, he was an anti-aircraft gunner. On the 18th of August, Charlotte and him were married in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He would be shipping out for overseas the next day. When in England waiting for deployment, he was able to visit his mother's family in Scotland, meeting cousins he had never met for the first time. His unit was part of the Italian campaign and eventually helped in assisting with the liberation of not only Rome and Italy, but later they continued for France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. While the war officially ended May 8th, 1945, Gumps would not return home from overseas until the week of January 15th, 1946, according to an entry I found in his father-in-law, John L. McKinnon's notebooks. Like many who came back from the war, they weren't the same men they were when they left. He gave up on his dream of being an engineer. Charlotte bore him a daughter, Catherine, born March 9, 1947. But she would die less than 2 months later on May 2nd, 1947. I believe this helped lead to a life of enjoying the drink a little too much. He drank to forget the loss of seeing friends die next to him, and then the loss of Catherine in infancy. And he drank to celebrate and remember the friends he returned home with, and good things in his life, like the birth of my mother in 1948. He wound up working as a cook in the mess hall at the Naval Radar Station in Sydney. It was while working there he met my father, who was a cook in the newly amalgamated Canadian Forces. And one night he brought him home to meet my mom. My grandfather loved and cherished his family. I cannot remember a Christmas, birthday, or other major event that he was not present. Even when we lived far away. In 1981, he had a major stroke, but he fought on and still took time for us. We were still important to him. My brother and I would spend summers there in Cape Breton in our early teens, and he would still be there for Christmases and other events. In 1987, when my brother graduated from high school, he was there, and he would have been there the next year for my graduation from high school if it hadn't been in the hospital at the time. The war and drinking, smoking, all that time played havoc on his body even before his stroke. I remember after my exams, my first year of university, it was my last day in my dorm. I was getting ready to move home. My parents came and picked me up, and we drove to Glace Bay. He had taken a bad turn. I remember that night we talked to the doctors, and we talked about how we wouldn't want attempts to resuscitate him. As hard as that conversation was, especially for me, I was only not even 19 yet. But we weren't sure what quality of life he would have. And the doctors weren't positive either. Anyways, that evening, we took turns sitting beside him. And early the next morning, while my mother and brother were on watch, he woke up and said clearer than anything he had said in the last 8 years, "I'm not dead yet." And he wasn't. He never left the hospital, as he went to spend the next 2 years of his life upstairs in what had become the veterans ward. It wasn't his home, but he made the best of it. He played crib with the boys and teased the nurses. I had 2 more years to enjoy him, which I cherished. I loved hearing his war stories, and now there was a whole bunch of new ones I got to hear from the other vets. I brought a friend from my university, my third-year university on spring break. I brought a friend who was attending the university, but was from the Netherlands. And though my father had never been stationed with the Canadian Forces in Europe anywhere, I had many friends that had at one point or another been. And they always talked about how much the Dutch people loved them as Canadians because of the Dutch liberation. It wasn't until that night, though, I realized how it went both ways. One of the old soldiers who I had never heard speak before, and on finding out that my friend was from Holland, he grabbed her by the hand and wheeled her to his room with her in tow and took out an old photo album. One of those ones that are sort of the black paper, all kinds of black and white pictures. And he began showing her the pictures and telling her stories about the families, these families who'd lost everything in the war, but they took him in to feed him and to thank him. And from what I can make out and I remember, that was after years away from his home, for the first time since arriving in Europe, he felt like a real human again, sitting down with a family at a table and having a civilized meal. That trip was the last time I would see my grandfather alive, as he died late in that summer when I was far away working at Air Command headquarters in Winnipeg. From what I've been able to piece together now, and from learning about his family and his early life, my grandfather used to be a faithful church-going person, though he wasn't much when I knew him. In fact, his mother-in-law, my great-grandmother, sent him a Bible for Christmas in 1944. In it, she wrote, "For your daily readings." Now, I'm not sure where he stood with God. I think he lost his faith somewhere between Europe and his first father dying. But it would come out after a few drinks as he would sing his favorite hymn, "How Great Thou Art." I found out he used to comfort himself while overseas by singing that song in his head or out loud to reassure him that God was greater than all the death and destruction he was seeing. And I like to think he sang it afterwards to reassure himself that God was greater than himself and all the destruction that he was rotting on his own body. As a Reformed Christian, who I hold fast to the tenet of justification by faith. So I'm not sure if what he had was a saving faith, but I think it was still proof that he understood the sovereignty of God and the great hope that came with that knowledge. My grandfather was a very special man. He taught me a lot by the things he said and by his actions. He taught me what a real hero is. He taught me about pride in your country. He taught me about love of your family and to cherish those things you have. I miss him a lot. So if you want to find out a little bit more about my grandfather's war experience, click here and watch this video.